I want to welcome everyone to this afternoon session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we will be focusing on a recent book by Benjamin Hopkins entitled Ruling the Savage Periphery, Frontier Governance and the Making of the Modern State, published by Harvard University Press. I'm Eric Arneson from George Washington University, co-chair of the Washington History Seminar, along with my colleague, Christian Osterman of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. This seminar is a collaborative venture of the Woodrow Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program and the American Historical Association's National History Center. And for the past decade, the seminar has been meeting weekly, usually, not always, but usually on Mondays. And we have a number of more sessions in November and December, and we will have a full lineup soon to be announced for the new year. Behind the scenes, there are a few people who make these seminars possible: Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center and Rachel Wheatley of the National History Center. And I'd like to thank two institutional supporters, the LePage Center for History and the Public Interest and the George Washington University Department of History, as well as a number of anonymous individual donors whose ranks we, as always, invite you to join. On the logistics front, you should know that today's session is being recorded and can soon be found on our institution's respective websites. And when we get to the question and answer section of the webinar, we ask that those with questions use the raise hand function on Zoom, and those watching on Facebook Live, you can email questions to Rachel Wheatley, whose email address is posted in the chat function. And we'll try to call on as many folks as we can. And with that, I turn the screen over to Christian Osterman, who will introduce today's author and then panelists. Christian.
Thank you, Eric. Great to see all of you. It's my real pleasure to introduce our speakers today, and I will introduce them in turn, then get them into a conversation with each other, perhaps with Eric and me as well, posing questions, and then turn the Zoom room open to all of you. Let me introduce our author, Benjamin Hopkins, first. Professor Benjamin Hopkins is Associate Professor of History and International Affairs at the George Washington University. He received his PhD from the University of Cambridge in 2006, and his research interests focus on Afghanistan, British imperialism, and the history of the South Asian subcontinent. He's authored 3 books: The Making of Modern Afghanistan, published in 2008, Fragments of the Afghan Frontier, published in 2012, co-authored with Magnus Marsden, and of course, Ruling the Savage Periphery, the book we'll talk about today. He's also co-edited Beyond Swat, again with Magnus Marsden. He's particularly interested in issues of state formation and state violence and the lasting effects of the past on the present. Ben, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christian. And thank you, everybody attending today. And a special thanks to the panelists. I feel this is a bit of a homecoming because this project was partly supported by a fellowship at the Woodrow Wilson Center in 2015. So it's a real pleasure to be able to show them their money's worth, as it were, with the talk today. I also want to thank the panelists, Elizabeth Leake, Geraldine, Davies, Lenovo, and Ben Johnson, who've all joined. As I emailed them earlier today, they've all had a really formative influence on this work in very different locales. Geraldine and I first met in the Army Archives in Buenos Aires years ago. Elizabeth back in Cambridge, and then Ben when I did an NEH seminar in Chicago. So it's really meaningful for me to have them comment on my work. The brief I was given was to just introduce the work and then really turn it over to the panelists to give an opportunity for discussion. And I'd introduce the work in a couple of ways. First of all, what is the book about? And what the book is about is it's really about the kind of peripheries of state power, the frontiers of the modern states, and in particular the problematic frontiers that today and in the past continue to present problems, as it were, to the international system as a whole and to individual states within that system. And what the book actually does is present a global tapestry, as it were, looking at a number of these problematic places and these problematic frontiers and the people inhabiting them, and examining how this international system and modern states over the course of the late 19th and into the 20th century really developed a coherent, and I would argue globally ubiquitous form of rule, a regime of rule that I call frontier governmentality. And so what the book tries to do is pair a story of specificity, looking at these various places around the world, which our panelists will talk about, ranging from the Northwest frontier, British India, with Afghanistan, to the Argentine Pampas, to the Arizona desert, to the Middle East, to Southern Africa, with a theoretically robust framing. And the purpose of it is to explain how these peripheral places were both produced and maintained, and what that production and maintenance tells us about the modern world that we live in. Because one of the things I argue in the book is that frontiers are not actually places, but rather practices. Frontiers are a set of practices which are manifest in specific places, and where they are manifest, there you have a frontier. So quickly, what are those practices, and what is this idea of frontier governmentality that I argue in the book? Well, I argue that the practices which constitute frontiers are fourfold. You find these practices strewn throughout the colonial, imperial, and indeed national world of the 19th and early 20th century in various forms. But when it comes together in this specific quadrangle, as it were, or constellation of four, that is where we find a frontier. And so these four elements in order are indirect rule. All the places that I look at have the state, as it were, subcontracting its authority to local holders of authority, be it chiefs or headmen or some traditional, quotation marks, holder of authority through whom state power is exercised. Secondly, we have what I call sovereign pluralism. You could call it layered sovereignty, you could call it suzerainty, you could call it divided sovereignty. But in this space, rather than exclusive claims to power, the states involved make highly attenuated claims to power and often share that power voluntarily with these local holders of authority. Of course, I'm not the first person to come up with this idea. Most famously, I think for us historians, Lauren Benton's work in A Search for Sovereignty really talks about this. My own area of training, South Asian history, we have a long tradition talking about British paramountcy. But as well, I think we could put American federalism in that same basket and think about it in a similar manner. The third element of frontier governmentality is what I call imperial objecthood. And this applies to the people who are subject to it, because in all of the places the book examines, the people inhabiting these spaces are inevitably excluded from the colonial or the national sphere, usually through judicial injunction, in the sense that they have no standing in a court of law. That said, they are nonetheless objects of imperial action. So the state is willing to act upon them, but denies them any sort of avenue to contest that state's rule, meaningful or not. And then finally, economic dependency, wherein the people inhabiting these peripheral spaces are made economically dependent on the surrounding economy, usually in the form of being rendered wage labor, and in particular wage labor of violence through recruitment into things like tribal militias or tribal policing. And so it's these four elements together: indirect rule, sovereign pluralism, imperial objecthood, and economic dependency, which constitute frontiers. And it's this focus on practice that I think allows one to conceptualize frontiers not as fixed in time and place, but as both multiple and mobile. So the examples that I look at in the book range from places with a remarkable fixity in terms of a frontier locale, as in the frontier between the Afghan lands and British India, versus spaces that are a rolling frontier, as we see, for instance, in the United States during the westward expansion, or likewise along the Argentine pampas during the conquest of the desert. Now, with that kind of model in mind, I try and tell the story of frontier governmentality by tracing both an imperial law called the Frontier Crimes Regulation, firstly around the British Empire as it's initially promulgated on the Afghan frontier and then replicated globally throughout the British Empire, but then substantively is both replicated and also separately born in places as far afield as the United States and the Argentine pampas. This is a story that, on the one hand, while I begin in the British Empire, works well beyond the British Empire. And if there's a limit to the book, I'd say it's my own limit in training as a historian that and we can perhaps talk about this in discussion, you would find these systems of frontier governmentality replicated, I think, in other European empires of the time as well. As well as thinking about the imperial career of a law, the book also talks about a number of actors in the late 19th and into the early 20th century who move through these global and bureaucratic spaces, bringing the knowledge of the law with them. People like Robert Sandeman or Henry Dobbs, Sir Bartle Frere, John Clum, or my favorite, Ignacio Fotheringham, who's a British officer that ends up on the Argentine pampas. All are these kind of chains of transmission that bring this law and this practice of frontier governmentality, spreading it throughout the world in the late 19th and early 20th century. And so in sum, before I turn it over to the panelists for discussion, I'd say, what does this book ultimately do? Where does it ultimately leave us? Well, I think it offers an insight into the way that the modern state system, which inhabits the world today, was constructed at a particular moment in the late 19th century. And the fact that the places it looks at, whether it be the frontier between modern day Pakistan and Afghanistan, the frontier between modern day Kenya and Somalia, whether it be the San Carlos Reservation in southern Arizona, these in various forms are still problematic places, poor, impoverished, often subject to violence, and at times also progenitors of violence. And I think rather than just understanding them, either through the lens of terrorism, which is often done with the Afghan frontier or Somalia, or poverty, we need to understand the way these places were constructed and how that construction is maintained through the course of the colonial and into the post-colonial world that we inhabit today. So I'll stop there and look forward both to the panelists' interjections as well as to everyone's questions.
Thanks so much, Ben. That was great overview of the book. We'll now call on the panelists, the other panelists, to provide some comments, which will be a mix of some substantive comments on the arguments and some questions. And Ben, I'm going to let you respond right away to the questions, so we have a bit more of a back and forth before we open it up to for the Q&A with everyone. Our first commentator is Elizabeth Leake. who is an associate professor of international history at the University of Leeds in the UK. She trained as a historian at Yale and the University of Cambridge and held a fellowship at Royal Holloway, University of London, before joining Leeds. Her research explores global histories of decolonization and the Cold War, with specific reference to 20th century South Asia. Her first book, The Defiant Border, The Afghan-Pakistan Borderlands in the Era of Decolonization, 1936 to 1965, came out with Cambridge University Press in 2017, and she has recently completed a second book, Afghan Crucible, A Global History of the Soviet Invasion of Afghanistan and the Accompanying Civil War. Can't wait for that one to come out. In the meantime, Elizabeth, the Zoom room is yours.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Christian and Eric, for inviting me to participate in this discussion of Ben's book. And of course, thank you to Ben as well for writing this really fantastic book. I should say, in some respects, it feels to me slightly shocking that the book is only just coming out, because in some ways, I feel like I've been wrestling with a lot of the ideas in it, I think, in our conversations, actually, since I arrived in Cambridge a very long time ago and ever since. I should also say too, Ben was generous enough in the last few weeks to also attend online my senior seminar with my final year undergraduates. And they also, I think, found the book really persuasive and really, I think, have engaged with the ideas in a lot of ways. So I wanted to actually start, I think, just my comments with a kind of a comment or reflection on my own background, which I saw echoed in Ben's acknowledgements. Which is coming from, for me personally, coming from Southwest Colorado and living and being born and raised in an area that's surrounded by Navajo reservations. When I started studying the Northwest frontier of colonial India and the so-called Pashtun tribes living in that area, I too was really struck by these parallels and this idea of the reservation in the American context, and then the ways that the Northwest frontier was so treated as a space apart by colonial India. So I thought that was a really interesting observation. And equally as well, I should say I was really struck when I went to Islamabad to do some research that Islamabad looks a lot like New Mexico as well. So there's sort of geographical parallels as well. But I think this sort of observation is kind of really at the heart of Ben's own project, which is why there are ultimately these places or spaces apart that end up being inhabited by local populations who ultimately end up being framed, as his title indicates, as being savage or being uncivilized. And I think Ben's really crucial contribution with this work is to think about frontier as a practice, as he's mentioned, rather than purely as a place. Though I think all of the places discussed in this book do tend to show as well that place is quite important in terms of the geographical spaces that were inhabited by many of the populations under scrutiny. But it's this kind of then this mixing and melding then of this kind of place, this so-called kind of savage geography or this violent geography, which links Ben's work with that of Martin Bailey's, but also then to the civilizing mission pursued by empires and imperial powers that kind of alighted savagery with the idea of the tribe as well. So one of the really important issues then, I think, for this book, and I come at Ben's book based on my own work on the Northwest frontier area of colonial India, though my work is more from the 1930s forward, and also work on the Northeast. And what I think is really important then in this story is how it does start in the Northwest frontier of India, so an area that frequently has been even considered peripheral in studies of the subcontinent, and he makes it really central, so making the periphery central to this history. What's really exciting then in Ben's work, as he sort of alluded to, is he moves from Northwest India to the Northeast, so to kind of Assam and what's now the Indian-Myanmar Chinese border regions. And from there, he moves on to Palestine, Nigeria, Kenya, and Southern Africa. And then from there, we jump to the United States, and particularly the Southwest and the Apache reservations, and from there to Argentina. So I think what's really interesting about Ben's work is it provides some really provocative questions to us as to how, what sort of global history is this? This is very much a global history, even though it's rooted in different locations. And I think it provides some really methodologically interesting reflections and considerations with that. So as Ben mentions, he looks at the frontier crimes regulation as this law that effectively has this extremely long afterlife, not only in what becomes Pakistan, but certainly in India and elsewhere across the former British Empire. But he then also focuses on parallels. And this is one of those sort of methodological issues that I think is really interesting. So what's really fascinating about the way that Ben has approached his study is that on one hand, it's looking at intersections and sort of the evolution of ideas and practices, but it's also bringing in parallels. I think that's a really interesting sort of mixture, which I think, just partly springs from Ben's interests, his expertise in the British Empire, but also then these really fascinating parallels that emerge in the American and Argentine contexts. I think what makes this book then as a consequence really useful, I think, for scholars and students alike, is that it's really, it can be read as a whole, but equally it can be read in parts, which I think can't necessarily be said for every book. And I think, which is really brilliant. I think it means it's so accessible to so many different kind of academics in different sort of areas of scholarship. I don't want to kind of focus too much on repeating what Ben said, so I've instead sort of thought about all of the different questions that kind of came to my mind. I'm sorry, Ben, I have a lot. And that's what's good, I think. This book is so thought-provoking, and I thought was just so fascinating in so many ways. So just to kind of free flow questions, please don't feel obligated to answer all of them. But I think that what's so interesting for me is thinking about the specific moment under consideration in this book, because realistically, when all is said and done, you're only looking at a handful of decades. And I was like, what is it about this particular moment? What is it about the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century that not only leads to the movement of this specific law, the Frontier Crimes Regulation, but also leads to these parallels? You talk a lot in the book about the significance of capitalism and land ownership, but is it really just capitalism that is creating these parallels and these parallel discussions in the United States, in Argentina, across the British Empire? Or what else is going on? What else is at stake here? In that sort of comparative mode too, I'm hoping at some stage you could expand a little bit on the case studies that you chose and why you chose that, which I realize is possibly a complicated question. But as I was reading particularly about the Apache reservations, I was like, well, are there comparisons with Canada in particular? And those sorts of thinking about the ways that the British Commonwealth or the White Dominion engaged with local indigenous populations. I mean, could we see the Frontier Crimes Regulation traveling in a different circuit through Northern North America? One of the other questions then as well is and kind of alluding to your title, which really puts the emphasis on this image of these populations as both tribal and savage, was this question of the end goal. So what were these laws and kind of what were these kind of forms of government ultimately supposed to achieve? So was it purely, and I think about this particularly in the context of the end of empire and decolonization, just kind of what was supposed to happen then at that stage? Were these areas supposed to stay, somewhat like the American Indian reservation, sort of in perpetuity? Were they supposed to kind of to evolve in some form? Kind of what was kind of the end game, I suppose, in terms of this conceptualization? Maybe there wasn't one. But then kind of expanding then on this link to decolonization and the end of empire, something that came to my mind was this really fascinating story you tell about Argentina. I hope I'm not stepping on toes of anybody of the other participants. But what I thought was really interesting was the way that so Ben in his chapter in Argentina discusses the kind of the agency of some of the local groups who kind of tried to question and undermine and subvert the Argentinian state's attempts to integrate these frontier regions. And what that really brought to my mind then were the state building processes that took place in the era of decolonization in the 20th century. And thinking particularly from my work, the agents and the Pashtuns of the Northwest frontier or the Nagas of the Northeast frontier, who also then started using this language of statehood and citizenship as a way of engaging with post-colonial state creation, even as they were framed as being tribal, under the Frontier Crimes Regulation, and in terms of kind of the way that the state still kind of dealt with them. So I know it wasn't necessarily in the scope of this book, but I really wondered, firstly, it's like, how do local populations take advantage of or engage with these issues? How do they engage with these laws or subvert them or give them new and alternative meanings? And I thought what was really interesting as well, in particular then with the case study of Argentina, is how you then see an early sort of precedent then for the ways that supposedly tribal populations or supposedly savage populations, as they were seen by the state, then increasingly question the applicability of these laws and their own independence, their own identity, as well as their relationship with a post-colonial state. And then finally, then, again, just to push on this issue of empire to nation state, especially because you bring in so many kind of contemporary and current issues, for example, with current developments and current movements amongst Pashtuns of Pakistan, I wonder then, even though we're thinking about the frontier as a practice rather than a place, how the hardening of frontiers into border regions then also further shapes the story. So I realize there's a lot of questions and thoughts. Again, just to reiterate, I think this book is so fantastic. It's so thought-provoking. And I think it's really significant as well for making us, and I think forcing us really importantly to think about the peripheries of empires, the peripheries of states as being central rather than being liminal. So thank you.
Great, thanks so much. Ben, you want to take on some of these questions, perhaps focused on the, especially the ones focused on South Asia, and leaving perhaps some of the Latin America, leaving the Latin America case a little bit for Geraldine, yeah?
Yeah. Thank you for those really kind words and sharp observations, Elizabeth. They raise a fantastic conundrum of questions. I think I'll back up maybe and talk a little bit about the genesis of the book, which might help orientate that. And I remember sitting in the British Library looking at archives from the northwest frontier of then British India, looking through the India Office records, and running for the first time into what were then called the tribal agencies, and until 2018 were the federally administered tribal areas of Pakistan. And these are areas along the border between British India and Afghanistan that the British essentially put up a fence and say, the inhabitants of this space will be ruled by their own customs and traditions. We get to say what are authentic customs and traditions in this space, but we're not putting regular administration here. And I was looking at a particular file about this space, which is also going to show my failing as a historian, in which I swear it was in the file, but I think it was in my notes. And because I didn't take good notes, I couldn't put it in the book. But I remember reading a report from a district officer who was documenting a qawwali, which, as I'm sure many of the audience will know, is a kind of Sufi religious ritual, usually around a tomb of a saint, involving dancing and singing. And I can't remember if it was just my clear impression or if it was in the file, but this was from the 1890s and I was reading it. And the first thing that I could think of was, this is ghost dancing. This official is talking about ghost dancing of the Lakota Sioux. It's exactly the same language he was using, the kind of fear-mongering that state officials were concerned about, the nefariousness of these local tribesmen doing something not quite right and something quite dangerous. And it really crystallized in my mind the thought, well, these tribal agencies are really like something I'm more familiar with, which you brought up, Elizabeth, and that is the reservations in the United States. And so that's what really led me to think about it, not just anecdotally, but to start to think about it seriously and think about, well, why is it we have these tribal agencies, native reserves in Africa, reservations in the United States that look substantively the same? The vernacular might differ somewhat between these, but in essence, the substance is quite similar. And I think it goes to that question you brought up about the specific moment, because in a way, the moment that the book documents is actually quite narrowly defined. It's really between approximately 1872 and 1885, at a moment when there are a number of wars that are going on simultaneously. There's the Second Anglo-Afghan War, there's the Anglo-Zulu War, there's the last frontier wars against the Apache in the Southwest, and there's the conquest of the desert in Argentina. And as you rightly point out, Elizabeth, part of the argument I make is that this is a particular moment for the expansion of capitalism globally, and we can talk more about that. But it's also a particular moment for states, because this book is really about states and the construction of modern states. And I think what's going on is not just the expansion of capitalism, though, like I say, that's a central element of this, but it's also the construction and moment of the creation of truly capable bureaucratic states. I mean, globally, through the 1850s and 60s, we have a number of challenges to state orders that, any state that survives that, whether it be British India through the Great Rebellion of 1857, or the United States through the federative crisis of the Civil War, emerge as a much stronger and much more capable state that can not only assert itself over the peoples along its periphery, in the case of whether it be the Afghan tribes or whether it be the San Carlos Apache, but more importantly, can more convincingly assert itself over its own agents. This is the moment when the legend of the man on the spot, where you have, a British Indian official or an American frontier official that goes out and does whatever, and then comes back, and says, fiat accompli, you have to deal with it. That's done. And I think part of the reason for that are technological changes. You now have telegraphy. States are able to get information much more quickly. They're able to assert themselves not only over those whom they rule, but over those through whom they rule in a really new way that they had never been able to do that before. And I think that's really, really important. And then the last point I'd make is, you brought up Islamabad looking like some of the other places. I gave a paper about the book at the American Ethnohistory Conference a couple of years ago, and I did put up a picture of Baluchistan and a picture of the San Carlos Reservation for the audience. And I myself could not tell the difference, which brings me perilously close to the idea of ecological imperialism, because many of these spaces do look very similar. And I don't think the book falls into that pit, but I think that there is something about the places that these frontiers and this frontier governmentality are manifest. These are poor places. These are places that ultimately the state makes the economic calculus that the extension of regular administration is simply too expensive, and that this is, for lack of a better term, a money pit. So what is the cheapest, most efficient way we govern it? It's too expensive to send out regular administration. You could have essentially a genocide, which these increasingly capable states perhaps do in specific instances, but those are also fairly costly activities. So the cheapest and in a way easiest course for these states to take is to throw up a proverbial fence, make these people live on the poorest of lands, on these reservations or tribal reserves or agencies, and have them governed by their own customs and traditions with a light touch and imperial oversight.
Thanks, Ben. Fascinating discussion. And we're equally looking forward to our next commentator. Really thrilled to have with us today Geraldine Davies Lenovo. She's a historian of Latin American history, specializing in the history of independent indigenous societies and frontiers in the Americas during the 19th century. She currently has a postdoctoral fellowship at the National Scientific and Technical Research Council and the National University of Quilmes, Argentina. She's also a visiting professor at UTDT, Argentina, and she holds a PhD in history from Georgetown University. She's currently working on her book on the confederacies in the Pampas and Patagonia during the 19th century. Apologies for that pronunciation there. You might want to clarify that for our audience. Anyways, Geraldine, it's wonderful to have you with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Ben, for the invitation and the Washington History Seminar. It is a really real pleasure to be able to participate from a distance and to read this amazing book. So thank you for that. So I found Ruling the Savage Periphery as an ambitious and outstanding contribution to global history, as well as to the historiography of each case study, especially for Argentina. On the one hand, this book brings together very distinct cases in terms of first, legal and institutional traditions. We have places framed by Spanish legal history and English legal history, and a wide variety of indigenous societies. Second, the age and timing of these states. We have a growing British Empire and on the one side, and newly formed nation states on the other. And third, it addresses regions with disparate positions within global capitalism. So this ambitious comparative scheme and its revealing outcome, I think really pushes historians of the global world, and especially of the British Empire, to widen their research and knowledge on peripheral and maybe also unexpected cases. These cases can reveal a central aspect of the nature of those empires and nation states. So on the other hand, regarding the history of Argentina, I think that this book acknowledges an imperial policies as part of a nation state formation process that is almost never framed in this way by historiography. So even when Argentina is the failed case of frontier governmentality, and so that's interesting part of the book, then book really challenges us to frame state policies as imperial practices, to unveil shared discourses and ideologies with formal empires, and to recognize how sovereign pluralism was, like also the case of the US, and I quote him here, obfuscated with the language of federalism and categories such as domestic dependent nations. In the case of Argentina would be the use of interior frontiers. So the introduction of the global perspective for the Argentine case highlights the importance and enduring legacy of the racist ideology that shaped expansion over the frontiers and the alleged disappearance of the indigenous society. And this perspective can really be extended to many other nation states in Latin America. I'm thinking especially those cases that at the same time were expanding their frontiers, such as Mexico, also Brazil, Bolivia in the Chaco region, and especially Chile. Chile is a very interesting case because I think that it gets even closer to the frontier governability than the case of Argentina, that is this failed case. So overall, this book successfully overcomes a global history that has focused on centers of global capitalism. It really shows how the marginal and the global south are integral parts of the whole system. And here again, I quote Ben, just as frontier governmentality collapses the dyadic spatial categories of center and periphery, it also collapses the temporal categories of colonial and post-colonial. Something else that I want to highlight about this book is its architecture. This book captivates you from start to finish. It first introduces the reader to what frontier governmentality is about and develops its first strong case, the Indian and Afghanistan frontier. And it then manages to maintain the intrigue of how exactly this phenomenon will apply to each of the other cases. And it does not reveal its secret until the end, I would say, trapping the reader in each of the carefully crafted chapters. Saying this, I'm going to say that including Argentina, I found it brilliant. And not only because Argentines love to be in the center of attention, as you know, but because this failed case, I think that reveals the pervasive and expansive effects of the frontier governmentality. Ben argues that Argentina was a weak state, subject to the British informal empire, where we see, and here I quote him again, the centrality of the British capital coursing through the veins of the Republic's economy, end quote. So this global periphery wants to exercise frontier governmentality in its own way, but lacks the resources. And what happens? Instead, it ends up doing what some readers of the last 5 chapters might have wished it happened, or at least in the last part of the history of each frontier, in the previous cases, integrating indigenous peoples as citizens. In showing the Argentine failure of pursuing that, this is how racism and power revoked legal equality, how indigenous people were erased from the discourse and history, how they were also subject to encapsulating policies and even exterminating practices such as the concentration camps. And if I extend today, how Mapuche people are today portrayed as also part of terrorist attacks and foreigners and not part of Argentina. So this counterexample, I think that helps us to perceive the almost suffocating extent of frontier governmentality as part of the origin and consequence of global capitalism, and also of liberal democracies. It seems there is no room at all for indigenous independence or sovereign pluralism, as Ben argues at the end in the conclusion, in this modern world. My last comment, followed by a couple of interconnected questions, is about the chapter 4, the chapter named The Colonial Spectre of Savagery, the chapter that I really, really enjoy, where Ben compares the work of Bartol Freire, Frederick Turner, and Domingo Sarmiento. This chapter also shows how similar ideas and mentalities can emerge simultaneously in such disparate places without a direct and strong connection. Sometimes they do have, but sometimes they're just referring to others, but they don't have a direct link. And there is something about his take on Sarmiento that I think can help to extend one of Ben's main arguments. This is study frontiers as practices and not as spaces, or maybe practices that ends up building frontier spaces. Why? Because Ben analyzes this work of Sarmiento, El Facundo, where Sarmiento is worried about the gauchos. And the gauchos are these rural subalterns that are not independent indigenous people. They might be of mixed race or white. There are a variety of people, but they live on rural areas. And are part of the Federalist Party or movement that, according to Sarmiento, held Rosas into power into the 30s and 40s. But later during the 60s, these bands of Federalist gauchos, of rural subalterns, and also Federalist leaders want to recover the government from who today is, at that moment is ruling, that it's Mitre, and later will be Sarmiento as a president. These people connected with unitarios and with these civilization ideologies. But a less known part of the history of Sarmiento, I think, is very revealing and has to do with, it reinforces the main arguments here in the book. Because before becoming a president, Sarmiento has to deal with these bands of gauchos in the Cusco region in San Juan. In this region, these bands make alliances with independent indigenous people in the context, and together they attack the frontier. And where Sarmiento is there, he not only has to see what he does, and he sends military expeditions and a lot of policies that we can integrate into the frontier governmentality, but he also writes a very interesting book about one of the Federalist leaders called El Chacho Peñalosa. And in this book, in this manuscript, he ends up Indianizing the gauchos, and he reveals his desperate incapacity of understanding and governing over rural popular sectors, whether they are independent indigenous people or just rural gauchos. Where I'm going with all of this? Well, if we understand frontiers as practices, I wonder if we could extend the ideas of frontier governmentality to study the way in which state authorities dealt with subaltern peoples in general, or maybe in other places that maybe we won't consider at the beginning as frontiers. Could we extend this to, for example, the African American people after the Civil War in the US? Could we extend this to the urban poor in Europe? Or to all groups falsely perceived as outside state fringes? In modern world, for example, people living in shanty towns or favelas in Brazil, that they always claim, the state always claims that the state is not there. And of course, we know there is a legal difference between groups recognized as citizens and those that they are not. And Ben argues about the difference between people that are subject imperial objects or colonial subjects. But the case of Argentina shows that even when the cases when they might be recognized as citizens, there is a huge distance between law and practice. The rule of difference still emerges, and the man on the spot has so much power over these marginal groups. So this case makes us think deeply into the relationship between capitalism, liberal democracy, and marginality in terms of space, ethnicity, race, class, and maybe even gender. I would like to know if, Ben, if you think we could extend the study of frontier governmentality to all forms of modern marginality or to other forms. And connected with this question, my second question has to do with something that also came up in Elizabeth's comment, and you spoke a little bit about it, has to do with indigenous agency. From the beginning of the book, it's very clear that its focus is on the state and that the main characters are bureaucrats, politicians, and intellectuals. But this last chapter in Argentina has a very big section about these indigenous leaders and what was their relationship with the state. So we also see a little bit in the Arizona case, I think, with Jerónimo and the Chiricahua and San Carlos reservations. So my question here is why in this chapter and not in the other ones, or what do you want to say about the other ones? And also, how do you think your work dialogues with the historiography that has been argued for cases of indigenous power, such as, for example, Hamalainen's Comanche Empire, that is actually at the backyard of the Apaches in the Arizona case. So I was wondering, how do you see your book dialogue with that historiography? And my last comment that I will build up on what Elizabeth and what also Ben clarified about that I think it strikes us, or it strikes everybody, is this timing, this 1870s and the 1880s as this defining moment of frontier governmentality. And you explain a little bit more on everything that you think is, I would say, important to that specific timing and looking forward. But I'm going to take you to the past. How comparing, if you've made this, maybe you already made this comparison in your mind, but when I was reading the book, because I have this Latin American teaching and knowledge, I couldn't stop thinking about the Spanish Empire. And the Spanish Empire stopped being an empire, I would say, in the 19th century. And I found many of the characteristics that many of these elements of frontier governmentality in the Spanish Empire's policies with frontiers, and also in the British in the US and the French, so not just the Spanish Empire. So I was thinking, what distinguishes this time from that time? The thing that struck me, and I would like to know if you agree or you cannot agree or you have a different take on this, has to do with the economic dependence and that moment, the encapsulating moment, that moment where people were encapsulated and turned into reservations. That moment when you say independent indigenous people that used to control trade and maybe play one state against the other cannot do that anymore. And why? Because I think that when you apply frontier governability in the long run, maybe you will find moments before in the Argentine case or in the other cases that might apply and others that won't. But I think that the economic dependence is key here and has to do with capitalism or what is happening in the world at that time. But to close this question, my question to wrap up is, what do you think distinguishes this time from other frontier policies of other empires in the past? And maybe if you think we could build a history on frontiers, governmentality, changing the elements that you set there for the 19th and 20th century, changing those elements for the past. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Geraldine, for these very good set of questions. Before I turn it over to Ben to address some of them, let me remind our listeners that you can get in line for your own question to Ben and the entire panel by using the raised hand function in the Zoom functionality, and also by emailing Rachel Week directly through our Facebook site. Ben, over to you.
Well, Geraldine, thank you for those very insightful and thoughtful questions and comments. And just to respond in brief, beginning with the last one, the comparison to past practice. I think you were completely right. The resonance of previous Spanish imperial activities on the Afghan frontier, as Elizabeth well knows, the keeping faith, as it were, with past Mughal practice of how to treat Afghan frontier dwellers, or even Sikh practice. Yeah, the state authorities are definitely, as it were, stealing a page and doing their homework. But there is something different going on. If I can say where the stealing of the page comes from, there's a fantastic anecdote that I think is really illustrative of it. And it actually goes to the Afghan frontier, where the first British ambassador to the court of the Kingdom of Kabul, a man named Mount Stuart Elphinstone that I wrote about in my first book, goes up to Peshawar, which was the winter capital of the Afghan kingdom in 1808, 1809. And as he goes up, he's got a couple of books to read. And these books really shape his understanding of what he sees of the Afghans. I talk about some of those books in my own work elsewhere, but the one of moment and of issue here is that he has Tacitus's volume Germania with him that he's reading. So as he's going up to the frontier, Tacitus's volume from 70 of the Common Era, basically outlines how the Roman Empire deals with the Germanic tribes on its frontier. And so when Elphinstone is there, he's got a model. He can see it. We do this. And I think there is a great deal of fealty in the British instance. I mean, one of the things of British officialdom in the empire in the early part of the 19th century is their classical training. They're all very well read in Latin and Greek, et cetera. And as you point out, Geraldine, the traditions of governance coming from the Spanish Empire into the Republican present of the 19th century for Latin America. But it is different. And I think, and this actually goes to why I call it frontier governmentality as opposed to frontier governance. And what is that difference? To put it bluntly, it's capitalism. I use Foucauldian's idea of governmentality because one of the lectures he gives in the College of France talks about how the political economy emerges as a space for state regulation in the 19th century. The state can begin to regulate this space and people through that space, something it hitherto did not have the ability to realistically do. And that's why I call it frontier governmentality, because that's precisely what is going on here, especially with that fourth element, economic dependence, where these indigenous peoples are entailed into both local but global capitalist economies as wage laborers. Generally as wage laborers in the forms of violence, so their frontier police or their tribal militias. And interestingly, they're used to police one another. As my colleague Anil Seal once said when I was describing this to him, you mean so they monetize them and monitor them at the same time, which is perfectly encapsulates what's going on. So I do think there is a fealty to past practice, but I do think at the same time, there is something fundamentally different going on here. Your question about indigenous agency. I make clear in the book that this is a book about states as opposed to the indigenous voices or resistance to states. And the reason for that is that's what I'm most qualified to speak about in terms of my positionality as a historian with the records I have. So to be perfectly honest, the Argentine case really called out for discussion of that because there's this incredibly rich, as you well know, catch of documents in the Archivo General de la Nación in Buenos Aires of these correspondence between indigenous caciques and the Republican government, which really, in all the other places that I looked, whether it be Kenya or Argentina, the United States, Afghanistan, no place replicated a catch like that, which just facilitated a really interesting interrogation. And then quickly, your last question about expanding this elsewhere. I go back to actually another colleague of mine, Joya Chatterjee, that I was speaking with probably at the beginning of this project. And we were talking about the frontier of British India. And at that time, I was thinking of it as place, not practice. And she pointed out that British India's largest frontier was not its exterior one along what would then be, Qing China and Afghanistan, but the 565 princely states on the inside, which I hadn't thought about. And then I was recently giving a talk about this and thinking about the United States' longest frontier is not the one with Canada. It's the 300 plus reservations internal to the United States that is its longest frontier, which really does create a different interrogation. And I think there's definitely a possibility of extending it in those ways, in those places. In terms of more broadly to subalterns, could be possible, could be very interesting. And I will be interested if people take this idea and run with it, where they run with it. So, yeah.
Thanks, Ben. Unfortunately, our third commentator, Ben Johnson, had to drop off the call due to a family emergency. So we hope he and his family are all right and wish him all the best. And we'll see if we can bring him in on another conversation in the future. Let me, Ben, ask you a couple of questions as well. Could you, since you're at the home here of the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program, at least partly, which with our sweet spot on archives, could you talk a little bit about the archives, the documents, the sources you consulted? I think in this day and age of alternative facts, I think talking a bit about the raw materials that we historians work with is an important piece of this discussion. So if you can highlight some of that, you just mentioned a couple of archives already, but I appreciate if you could broaden that.
Well, I think this goes back to why Elizabeth brought up that we've been talking about this for so long, because it really is a globe-spanning work in ambition, if not fully in execution, which means that it entails archives from around the world. Just to name a few, there's a treasure trove from the National Archives in India, from the Punjab Provincial Archives in Lahore, from both the National Archives in London and the British India Office records at the British Library in London as well. And the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in London, the US NARA from Washington, DC, the University of Arizona Special Collections for the San Carlos Reservation in Arizona, and as well then the multiple archives in Argentina where Geraldine and I met, both the Army Archive and the Ministry of Defense Archive, as well as the archive in the National Archive. You know, one of the really interesting things about using these was, and I tell my students this, in a way, I think we're the last generation to do this type of archival work with the digitization of archives, which has certain advantages and disadvantages. In doing that, you know, I'm not able to subject my archival material to a search through big data, for example, to find trends that maybe you can do with some of the newer materials. But on the other hand, I get serendipity. So for example, one that I think is really illustrative of this was from Argentina, looking through the presidential papers of Julio Roca, who was the defense minister that led the conquest of the desert, and then at the end of it becomes actually the president of Argentina. And I was going through his papers, which were in terrible ordering. I mean, there was really no logic to it at all in the National Archives. And I got to one piece of paper that was, you know, raggedy on the side, torn. And of course, I'm trying to work through this material as quickly as possible. But something that caught my eye was Afghanistan. And I'm sitting in the National Archives in Buenos Aires thinking, why is there something about Afghanistan in here? And what it was that Roca, as president, at the same time that he's presiding over the conquest of the desert, had all the news reports from the Times of London about the Second Anglo-Afghan War, which is contemporaneous to this, translated into Spanish. And he writes a covering memo, which fortunately I did have the good sense to photograph, in which he actually writes, see, this is why we're going into the pampas. We're going into the pampas for exactly the same reason that the British are going into Afghanistan. They want to preempt the Russians. We want to preempt the Chileans. And the kind of serendipity of running into this at random, which I would never, ever find in other circumstances, and be able to pull that out was quite amazing. But because of that, it also took me 10 years to write this book. We had to spend a lot of time in South Asia, spent nearly a year in Buenos Aires. Actually, Geraldine, when we were there, our second child was born, so that's how when we met. And it really was, a globe-trotting, as it were, work.
Christian, unmute.
I'm sorry. Let's open it up for Q&A by the audience, and Eric and I might still chime in at a later stage, but we've got some questions lined up. First, I'd like to call on David Kanan. David Kanan, if you could please identify yourself and unmute yourself first.
Yeah, thank you. This is really interesting, and I look forward to reading the book. A couple of questions of temporal comparison. Like the commentators, and I was thinking about empires and whether, how much comparison there might be between the state building and imperial construction. I thought about the Teutoburg Forest, but more relevant to what the discussion was, I wonder if political economy also has a greater reach back farther in time, and if it really is just capitalism that makes the difference. Richard Eaton, in his book on the Bengal frontier in the early modern period, suggests that and even in the period of the Delhi Sultanates, that aggressive agrarianization on the Bengal frontier made it into a very different kind of a space. And so I wonder if pre-capitalist political economy presents some greater comparison than has been suggested so far. Shift far forward, I was wondering, Professor Hopkins, if you've looked at some of the work by Central Asian anthropologists on contemporary borders in the former Soviet space, and how the locals have themselves attempted to make themselves into a space apart, not resisting the state or fighting it, as in perhaps on the Afghan frontier in the 19th century, but actually accepting the existence of the state, but making themselves into subjects, not objects of the relationship. Madeline Reeves edited a book in 2014, Border Work, in which she did some of this work. Anyway, just some questions about comparison. Are there larger comparisons to be made with things going on in other spaces and other times?
Ben?
David, thank you very much for a really great question. Yes, I think you're right that there is an economic continuity that can be traced back. But I do think that what's happening in the 19th century is different. So for instance, in my first book about Afghanistan, I look at how in the early 19th century, with the advent of the British East India Company in South Asia, Afghanistan's previous role as really central to a regional economic order is collapsed, and Afghanistan is peripheralized with a collapse of its political order that goes along with that. And that's the moment that Afghanistan is then set into the international system. So it's not that economics doesn't matter beforehand, but I think the scale is different. You have the introduction of wage labor at a very granular level, that individuals are now, being involved into a communal economy, more deeply penetrating these spaces than hitherto had ever done before. A good example is Radhika Singh Ha's recent work about Afghan coolie labor, actually, that is used to build railways along the frontier. And what is it in their labor that is used and that is different under the British is that they're financially compensated as opposed to a kind of levy and mass system that the Sikhs used. The other issue you bring up about with Madeleine Reeves' fantastic work, two things on that. Yes, is the short answer, but I'll go two ways with that. Number one, the issue about how the people of these spaces are reacting. So one of the interesting things today in Pakistan is something called the Pashtun Tawafuz movement. So it's only in 2018 that a constitutional amendment formally abrogates the federally administered tribal areas. Whether that actually comes to fruition is quite open to discussion, but it actually is supposed to collapse it. Now, this Pashtun Tawafuz movement, which isn't an anti-government movement, but it's largely Pashtuns from these tribal areas. The really interesting thing about this protest movement are the claims they're making on the state. And the claims they're making on the state is, don't treat us differently. Don't treat us as particular because we're Pashtun, but rather treat us as Pakistani citizens. What we want are the universal goods of rights and services and obligations that go with Pakistani citizenship. And what's really interesting is to see the Pakistani state's reaction to this, and really pushing firmly back against that. The last kind of anecdote I give about applicability elsewhere, I think was best illustrated by a discussion I had with Andres Rodriguez, who is a China historian at the University of Sydney in Australia. And he and I were having a discussion at one point where I was telling him about this. And he says, well, wait a minute, that sounds really familiar. He works on the Yunnan borderlands in Republican China in the 1920s. And his point was that it sounded very similar to how the Republican government was treating the ethnic minorities along the borderland with Burma and elsewhere at this point in time. And so as we kind of discussed it further, we came upon the chain of transmission, and that chain of transmission of all things was the YMCA, because the YMCA had been charged with the Southwest reservations in the United States from the late 19th century onwards. And then under Chiang Kai-shek, who was a committed evangelical Christian, brought over to China. And once they're in China, are using and replicating some of the lessons learned on the American reservations in reservation-like spaces of Southern China during the Republican era. My guess from a couple of recent books I've seen is that similar things are going on by the Japanese during their colonization of Taiwan and against the Ainu up in Hokkaido. I'm pretty sure the Dutch are doing very similar things in Indonesia. And there's been some fantastic comparative work between Soviet Central Asia, actually pre-Soviet Central Asia, and for instance, the Lakota Sioux. There's a book by University of Colorado Press that looks at the Cossacks and the Sioux, or of course, Kate Brown's fantastic work that compares the American kind of heartland with Soviet Central Asia. So yeah, I think there's definite opportunity for that.
Ben, can I just jump in really quickly? Because I think one of the points that we keep coming back to is the specific chronology of the book and the time period you're focusing on in particular. And maybe something we haven't touched upon quite so much. Obviously, you mentioned Lauren Benton in your introductory remarks, but it is this question of the rule of law, isn't it? And this fact that this is specifically a moment where effectively the otherness of these populations is being codified and made a legal category. And what's so sort of peculiar about it, and I hope I'm not preempting Mark Condos's question since Mark has also worked on this topic, but it's the fact that effectively it's legalizing an otherness, right? And that seems to be sort of different from what's happening in earlier time periods. And what perhaps makes this so unique is it's this moment of not only huge violence and militarization, but also this fundamental kind of legalization of categories as well. So to kind of parallel the capitalism and political economy story.
Totally agree. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Great. Well, why don't we go then to our next, to Mark Kondos. Mark, please unmute yourself.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I have a sleeping baby next door. I don't want to wake her up. So yeah, I'm Mark Kondos. I'm a lecturer at King's College London, assistant professor. And I've known Ben since Cambridge, actually, when he very kindly explained how everything worked there when I first got there. So first, just Ben, thank you for a great book, really thought-provoking, really fascinating. And I look forward to teaching with it eventually. But to my question, so in your book, you explicitly reject James C. Scott's argument about the art of not being governed. And I think you make a very important and convincing point on how these spaces weren't ungoverned, but they were subjected to a very violent, coercive, and exploitative alternative system of control. But it seems to me that a lot of the strategies that Scott outlines in his book contribute, alongside geography, the ecology of these regions, to the inability or the unwillingness of these states to impose so-called regular forms of rule. And I know, at least in the example of the Northwest frontier, there are fitful attempts to convince the Pashtuns to come to settled regions, take up agricultural pursuits, and become propertied subjects, the preeminent signifier of civilization, as you point out in your book. So I wonder, to what extent do these states still harbor the hope that these objects will eventually become subjects and subsumed to the regular state, and in the end, do we really need to throw James Scott out entirely?
Well, of course, in writing a book, it's always helpful to have a straw man, right? And so, while I disagree with Scott's construction, I wouldn't throw the baby out with the proverbial bathwater. I do think that Scott obviously is an enormously influential work and does have some some insight here. Of course, the other one that often comes up in these frontier spaces is Agamben's work on state of exception, right? That these are somehow exceptional spaces. And one of the real key arguments that the book presents is that, no, these are not exceptional spaces. These are not accidents. They're not leftovers. And to get to your point about a kind of assimilationist project, what is the aim of this? I mean, that is something that Elizabeth asked before. I think one of our problems as historians is that we sometimes think too much of the state actors, in the sense that definitely looking through this material made me realize how, for lack of a better term, lazy, if not taxed, states are. That we might like to look for, what's going on here? What is the strategy of rule? What are they trying to do here? And often, I think the real answer is they're just trying not to get into trouble at that particular time. And they often don't think through the lasting implications of whatever they're doing. A good example of this is how the Frontier Crimes Regulation travels. So when the Frontier Crimes Regulation is constructed and promulgated in 1872, the way the British Raj then rhetorically justifies it is, this is a particular response to these people, the problematic Pashtun that we keep having these problems with on the frontier. So it's couched in a language of cultural specificity. It's only about these people. And that law, of course, gets passed in 1887, and then finally in 1901, the one that's still on the books. But through the person of Henry Dobbs, who was a district commissioner in Baluchistan, so where the law was in effect in 1912, when the British Indian Expeditionary Force invades Basra in 1914, because of course, as part of the Great War, the Ottoman theater on the eastern side is given the responsibility of the Indian government. So the Indian army invades Basra in 1914. What's really interesting is Dobbs goes with that expedition, and Dobbs goes as the revenue officer. So Dobbs is outside of Basra, and he's looking over the marshlands of southern Iraq. And he essentially says, look, I'm hard pressed. I'm one of few imperial officials. And more to the point, I've seen these guys before. Yes, they live in marshes and I was in mountains. They speak, Arabic versus Baluch. But these are fundamentally the same people, animated by the same kind of irrational proclivities to violence, towards blood feuds, something that's kind of trapped in the past. And so he puts on the books what becomes known as the Tribal Civil and Criminal Disputes Regulation, which is a copy of the Frontier Crimes Regulation that then goes on and exists in Iraq until 1958. And actually the better example, and I'll finish with this one, is the Kenyan example, because there we're not even pressed for time with the Great War. In 1932, on the northeast frontier, it's called the Northern Frontier Province of Kenya that abuts Somalia. They have this problem of these, fanatical tribal people, the Somalis, right? And so they talk about what to do, et cetera, et cetera. Well, when they get around to producing the law for Kenya, which is called the Special Districts Administrative Ordinance, and this is a lovely archival moment, I found it in Q. The Special Districts Administrative Ordinance that the law member for the Kenyan Viceroy's Council produces is, at the front of the file. And in the back of the file, slipped in, is the Frontier Crimes Regulation from British India. And all the law member had done in red was cross out India and wrote some Kenya, and crossed out Pashtun and Baluch and wrote Somali. So it read as the Frontier Crimes Regulation, the Special Districts Administrative Ordinance for the British colony of Kenya applied to the Somalis. And this is not even at a moment of imperial tension where you have the lack of resources. It's 1934, and yet it's just the kind of laziness, as it were, of imperial violence and imperial governance. Well, it worked there, it's gonna work here.
Thanks, Ben. Really fascinating stuff. Let's
Christian, unmute again.
Sorry, thanks, Ben. Let's go to our fascinating stuff. Let's go to our next audience member, Michael Novak.
Oh, good afternoon. Can everybody hear me? Okay, thanks. Professor, this was a very interesting book. I very much interested in comparative history, so I think it's very cool how you put all these different things together, because I would have never thought to compare like the Great Plains to Afghanistan or things like that. My question for you is, I'm wondering if I don't know if this is the proper term for it, but I wonder if you've given any consideration to internal frontiers where there was this sort of, for lack of a better word, lazy governance of minority groups. Because the thing that comes to mind for me immediately is the Pale of Settlement in Tsarist Russia, where there was this area, there were these shtetl areas where Jews were allowed to settle, and they were sort of given autonomy, but at the same time not, and were frequently abused. So I'm wondering if you see any parallels between that sort of thing and the frontier areas that you talk about in your book.
Thank you, Michael. That's a great question. I think there is space for an exploration of that. I do think there will, of course, be limits that this does break down in applying to other places. So I can't speak to the Pale of Settlement, which of course comes to mind. The other one, given my own specialty, that comes to mind is Eric Beverley's work on Hyderabad and the princely states within British India. I do think there is a discussion to be had about, for instance, the princely states, which there are a number of in British India, and how this applies and at the same time doesn't apply, because there are distinctions to be made. And actually in the chapter about the Frontier Crimes Regulation, I do take some time to try and distinguish the frontier areas, which are called independent, as opposed to the princely states within British India, which are called sovereign, which actually, though that might seem like splitting hairs, as Elizabeth rightly pointed out, the language of law is particularly important in this moment, both to those who are exercising this violence over these people because they justify that violence through the language of law. But also, I think we need to take that language seriously. That's a roundabout way of saying, you know, I think there are a lot of other places this could apply, and I hope other people will take it up.
Great, thank you, Ben. Let's go to yet another question from our audience. Craig Whittle.
Hello, thanks very much. Yeah, I'm Craig Whittle. I'm just finishing up a PhD on the Criminal Tribes Act and Criminal Tribes Settlement System in British India. So this is all absolutely fascinating and great stuff. And I think the Criminal Tribes Acts are a good example of Elizabeth's phrase, the codification of otherness, which, thank you very much for that phrase as well. I'm going to, I shall use it in my work. One of the things that caught me by surprise when I was doing the study was the extent and the intensity of the role of the Salvation Army and other missionary organizations in actually running some of the settlements in the criminal tribe system. And it seems like the British administration, whilst initially skeptical about missionary organizations, by the 1910s or 20s, were quite happy to do what we would recognize today as outsourcing. And so I just wondered, it also struck me, it was reminiscent of some work in Canada in the late 19th century by some US Methodist organizations, where they kind of created what they call modeled villages, I think the Grape Island settlement, for example. So the question is whether and to what extent the involvement of non-government or missionary organizations, whether you found that to be a common feature in and across the frontiers in your own study. Thank you.
Craig, thank you for a great question. Yeah, I mean, number one, the Criminal Tribes Act comes along at the very same moment of the Frontier Crimes Regulation. So obviously this is, you know, part and parcel, as it were, of a particular moment, because you have the Frontier Crimes Regulation in 1872, the Criminal Tribes Act in 1871, and the Interline Regulation on the Northeast frontier in 1873. And I think it really all comes out of a moment for the South Asianists in the audience that goes back to Mantena's book, Alibis of Empire, and what's his name? Oh my gosh, I knew I'd flub a name in the middle of this. The Viceroy's legal council member, who escapes me at the moment. But your broader point about missionaries and missionary activity. This is one of those really interesting places where they play a slightly different role. And actually, if I was going to make a distinction about how this law operates, the one that really is arresting is how the Frontier Crimes Regulation, or frontier governmentality, operates by colonial forces amongst Muslim societies as opposed to non-Muslim societies. So for instance, on the Northeast frontier and on the Criminal Tribes Act, yes, Harold Tincture Fisher's recent book on the role of the YMCA, and I know Anand Yang has worked on the Salvation Army. You know, that is really a key role that's played there of those. It's not the same on the frontier for the Afghans and the Pashtuns. And I think that the issue that confronts the colonial authorities on the Northwest frontier of British India, or in Mandatory Iraq and Mandatory Palestine, Transjordan, and these other places, is that fundamentally Muslims are people of the book with a literate tradition. And they're almost invariably in these laws referred to as tribesmen. Whereas on the Northeast frontier, where the Frontier Crimes Regulation gets replicated in the Chin Hills and the Kachin Hills, the inhabitants of these spaces are always referred to as tribals. And there is, you know, missionary activity and missionary work. Don't forget the Baptists, the American Baptists are extremely important, both for their missionary activity, but also for their linguistic activity. The Baptist Press in Calcutta is extremely important for basically cracking the code of indigenous languages. And this is one of the differential stories that emerges here. How differently is it where Muslim societies are treated in this than non-Muslim societies?
Thank you. Let's go to one more question from the audience. Wasma, oh, please unmute yourself. Wasma, oh.
Hi, Ben, and hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, please introduce yourself.
I'm Wajma Usman at Temple University in Philadelphia. My question was, thank you for this fascinating panel. I learned so much. I was wondering if you could elaborate and talk a little bit about your title, the title, Ruling the Savage Periphery, and colonial language in general around topic, calling, people like the Pashtuns and other people savage and unruly and so forth. If you could, explain a little bit about that. Thank you.
Sure.
Wasma, thank you so much for pointing that and opening that conversation. So there's a couple of things on that. First of all, as a historian, I employ, always in quotation marks in the book, the language of the sources. And in the book, I have a lengthy discussion problematizing it. Why is it that we have this rhetoric of calling not only the Pashtuns or the Kachin or the Mapuche or the Apache savages or uncivilized and barbarians, which is clearly a discourse to delegitimize, a tool of delegitimizing and dehumanizing these people by the colonial state and the colonial authorities. So there is a lengthy conversation about that in the book. Of course, that conversation in a way, you have to get beyond the title, which I had a long-running, for lack of a better term, creative disagreement with my publisher on, which I think actually goes to, the economics of modern publication. I very much wanted, if they were going to use that title, that savage go in quotation marks. I wanted that signal, and they absolutely refused. And not only did they refuse, but it gets even slightly more amusing. In the first mock-up for the cover art, they sent me a cover, not with the picture that's presently on the book, which is pretty anodyne, but a picture with two Native American bodies. You couldn't see the heads. They were standing in a pose, but superimposed on them was savage. And I said, no, you cannot under any circumstances do that. I mean, that's so problematic on so many levels. And the most amazing thing of that was that they didn't understand why it was problematic. I had to explain, you can't do that in this way. That's just so wrong. Which I think then goes to, and Wasma, your own work really speaks to this, the role of capitalism in modern publication and in the academy itself, right? That Harvard University Press, though a university press, still wants to sell their books in certain ways, and it does open up certain opportunities and foreclose other opportunities for how we present our work.
Great, thank you. We're getting close to the end of our seminar here, so let me turn it over with thanks to Ben and Geraldine and Elizabeth, to Eric for a final question and final remarks. Eric?
Yes, thanks all. Ben, throughout the book, you repeatedly bring in the recent past or the present. And at one point in the chapter on Argentina, you talk about there are no easy fixes to the legacies of frontier governmentality. In other places, you talk about Somalia, Nigeria, Pakistan. You mentioned the 2014 Army school attack there, and you call it another data point for the metrics of brutality, which is frontier governmentality's most pronounced legacy. Could you talk about that legacy and why, after so many years, this is still an issue? If in the period that you were talking about at the end of the 19th century, so central to this process was the distinction between civilization and savagery, and the role that, say, capitalism and or belief in private property played. That was then, this is now. But why is the legacy still so pronounced?
Thanks, Eric. And there is definitely as the beginning and end of the book both indicate, a concern about the present. And that concern about the present is born of a couple of things. I mean, number one, being a historian of South Asia, we often talk about post-colonial states. Elizabeth, in her own comments, brought up the empire to nation. And I think what the book fundamentally points to is not only is that incomplete, but was that ever intended? Actually, to put it in the context of the United States, I'll tell a quick anecdote about the legacy of violence in the United States, because that violence isn't always necessarily actual, like some of the shootings, for instance, that are documented in the book. But with the San Carlos Apache, so the San Carlos Apache Reservation is one of the largest in the United States. It's the second poorest after Pine Ridge. If you look at all the metrics, it is frankly just on the bottom in all kinds of ways that it doesn't want to be on the bottom. What happened with San Carlos was that back when it was established in 1872 as an executive reservation, that means the federal government could clip it at will. And so when, of course, the largest copper mine in the Western Hemisphere was discovered by Phelps Dodge in 1880, that was clipped off the reservation and is now the Morenci mine in southern Arizona. So you might think, okay, that was then, this is now. Well, let's fast forward to the present, where Rio Tinto has discovered the largest untapped reserve of copper in the Western Hemisphere on reservation land in a place called Oak Flat. And Rio Tinto and its Australian mining conglomerate went to the tribe and asked to do a land swap, which the tribe said no to because the land had religious value. Of course, the forces of capitalism are never going to let that lie. And so Rio Tinto recruited the then senior senator of Arizona, John McCain, to force the land swap through on the defense spending bill as a rider. So, the must-pass bill through Congress that has to go through is where they put it and force this land swap through. So this is, 2011, I think, is when it went through, when we have this continuing violence done to these people. And I don't think it's an aberration or it's an accident or it's a leftover of the system that constructed frontier rule. I think it's an outcome that is at worst intended and at best is unforeseen, but it is a fundamental part of the design. And so sadly, I'd say I finished the book on a rather pessimistic note about, what can we do here? And I really don't have the answer, because I think both the past legacy, but also the present is not indicative of an opportunity to make this right, as it were.
Thank you, Ben. And thank you, Geraldine, Elizabeth, and Christian. And of course, thanks to those of you who asked questions and otherwise joined us this afternoon. I unfortunately have to draw this to a close, but I invite you all to join us next week on Monday, November 30th at 4 p.m. for the next installment of the Washington History Seminar, one that features a new book by Sarah Wagner entitled What Remains: Bringing America's Missing Home from the Vietnam War. And then 2 days later, on Wednesday, December 3rd, 2nd, we'll be back again for a session of the seminar for Victoria de Grazia's The Perfect Fascist, A Story of Love, Power, and Morality in Mussolini's Italy. That's December 2nd. Till then, take care and good night.